This episode is brought to you by /comment.
I'm Rich Heimlich. I'm the founder of the very first third-party QA company in the entertainment industry. I later became the author of the official SoundBlaster book series. One of the biggest things to know about the audio industry back when it dawned was it was very similar to the film industry. There was sort of a silent industry, and then it evolved very much like the movies did. In this case, audio, as it is even today, has always been viewed by many people as the ugly stepsister of video. And that's pretty much where the story begins. Everybody looked at audio as just an extra, something that we'd get to at some point, but nobody really cares about audio. They care about video. And if you go back to the dawn of the PC industry, you had IBM out there that creates the first PC. And meanwhile, there were many other platforms available, and most of them were better with sound, but the professionals, the PC people, viewed those as toys. So if you wanted to play a game, you bought a toy. You bought an Atari, and you took that home and hooked it up to your TV, and you played games on it. The same thing with an Apple II. Most people hooked it to a TV monitor. So again, it wasn't a professional tool. So the PC starts to evolve, and of course, it had to start out with basic audio. And in this case, we're talking about a silver dollar size monochrome speaker whose sole purpose was to go beep when you turned on the PC. And that's what it did for virtually the entire life of the PC. That was 99% of its entire use. And we pretty much dealt with that for a good number of years, all the way through the early 80s into the mid 80s and towards the late end of the 1980s. Then in about 1985, we started seeing some real alternatives. Companies like Kovacs came out with something called the Speech Thing. We had a company called Hearsay that came out with the Hearsay 1000. And so all of a sudden these novel new products were coming out trying to revolutionize the PC industry from an audio standpoint. And they just couldn't gain any traction initially, but they were certainly curious. Then in August of 1987, I got a phone call from a guy named Martin Preble. And Martin was a music professor, and he had got an idea. He had been working with Yamaha and their YM3812 FM synthesizer, just kind of a piano playing chip. And his idea was to take that, couple it with a headphone jack, and put it in an expansion card for a PC, this new PC concept. And so he went about trying to sell people on the concept and got nowhere. He went to all the various shows, which back then would have been still CES and Comdex and other local shows. And he would give out these $300 developer kits to any booth that would listen. And in this case, what he didn't realize was he was giving out these kits to marketing and PR representatives. They would take those kits, promise him the world, hey, we'll give this its due diligence, and go home, hand them to their kids, and the kids would play piano on them, learn to play piano, and that was all that ever happened with him. So months and months and months of this went by, and him just getting more and more frustrated and realizing he's getting nowhere, and he's quickly going broke. So, still thinking he had an idea, he started looking around and he found my company. So I had a company called Topstar. We did third-party quality assurance for the game industry. We were the very first people trying to do this. And at that time, we had a good segment of the industry as clients. So he figured, hey, this guy's talking to the people I need to talk to. Let's see if we can get him to like our product and recommend us, make some introductions. So he flew me to Toronto. I took a look at what he had. It was clear to me that this was evolutionary. It was much, much further ahead than anything I had seen. And I felt like I had some clients who might be interested in this product. So I told him I thought I could help, and I went back home and started calling some of my clients, showed them the product, and they started to believe. And prior to that, nobody believed. So contrary to what you may have heard, Sierra Online was not the first one to come out with sound. This is a story everybody has told. It was actually Taito and a company called Velocity. Both were clients of ours, and we were able to brush these things to market with, they were late products, and we were able to get them to build in support for the Ad Lib card. Velocity made a jet fighting game, so you can imagine with just FM synthesis, rather curious to try to get jet sounds out of an FM synthesizer, but we pulled it off, their gun sounds and whatnot. So those were the first products to actually jump out to market with Ad Lib support. Ad Lib quickly gained market share. The developer base grew quickly, and they started dominating that market. The curious part about that is that dominating the market then is not the same thing as dominating the market today. Back then, the idea of the biggest seller would sell 250,000 copies in a year, or even 250,000 over the life of the product. Today, 250,000 units would be an abject failure. You'd have to do at least that per month to even be on the charts. So, it was a different time frame. It was much more of a hobbyist environment then. One of the other pieces of software that was interesting in the mid-'80s was a piece of software from Access Software called Real Sound. And here was an effort where everybody else was going hardware, and Access was coming up with a software solution that anybody could use. The issue with it was that, of course, with that basic hardware, we were pumping out digital sound out of this little monochrome speaker, and the hardware wasn't up to snuff. So anytime you wanted to play a sound sample, you had to stop everything that was going on in the foreground. So we had a golf game we were working on, and the golfer would swing, you would hear the thwack hitting the ball, the entire video would stop, you waited for the sample to finish, and then the swing would continue. And that was their idea of a solution. That's how rudimentary things were back then. One of the things that you need to understand about that time frame and how basic it was, the PC and all of its clones, IBM and different companies back in those days, had a very basic design. You had a computer that most clones didn't even have a time or date chip. When you turned on the computer, it was January 1st, 1980 at midnight. And if you didn't set the time or date, that's what all your files were stamped as. And you turned off your PC and turned it on again, it was January 1st, 1980, once again. To get around that, you actually went out and bought products to supplement the PC. And this was the beauty of the PC, where you could say, oh, I want more memory. And of course, gamers want more memory. So they would buy memory, or they would buy a time and date chip, or they would buy a new video card, or in those days, a fledgling hard drive, which came on something called a hard card, which was an expansion card that you put into your PC. The problem was that almost all of the PCs of that era had 3 expansion slots. So as a gamer, you were really put up against a wall here. You had a situation where you wanted to add something like enhanced sound, but could you really afford to take up that critical space? And this was something that Ad Lib, at the very beginning, found out they had to fight. And one of the biggest surprises for most people today might be the realization that we actually had to push the consumer into adopting sound. They didn't want it. They actually fought back against this, and Ad Lib had a very, very difficult time gaining consumer acceptance. So, they had to convince people that it was worth this valuable landscape to add this $300 sound card that would essentially, as far as they were concerned, many consumers, do nothing but let them play piano. They couldn't see the correlation between the growth in games and how much better it would envelop them and make the experience that much better. And giving up that space for a clock chip or a hard drive, anything that they might want to do later. God forbid they wanted a better video card. So, and that was always, again, the ugly stepsister problem. So the reason that you had difficulty convincing people with solutions like the Atari ST, the Amiga, Commodore 64, again, all of these products were viewed as toys. Parents bought them for their kids, and the kids used them to play games. And parents saw that and immediately made this distinction that these are toys. These are game machines. They're game platforms. And of course, all this predates the Xbox and the PS3, PS4. So, this was fledgling kind of thinking back then. So they were forever branded that way. If professionals, of course, used the Amiga. I loved an Amiga, but it was 90% of the time still used as a game platform. And graphic artists jumped on it, but graphic artists at that time weren't even called graphic artists. They were just crazy people doing things nobody understood. And so that was that outside thing. So then you get the PC and you get Lotus 1-2-3, you get all these powerful pieces of software that start to push heavily on the business side, and more parents now have them at home. So the kids started realizing, hey, here's a machine. My parents aren't using it all this time. I'd like to use it, and there's all this software coming out for it. And within short order, the PC software section dwarfed every other section in stores. So it sort of was an odd chicken egg scenario where the PC just ultimately prevailed. And so we ended up with this odd situation for gamers where we had a platform that really wasn't built for games or for audio. Anything, in fact, the exact opposite is true. So for years, we had a problem convincing anybody that the games industry was actually the driving force behind the PC market share. And some of the best named people in the industry, press people, pundits, took years and decades to figure this out. And it wasn't until really the first sign of this was Myst that really surprised everybody that, wow, you can sell millions of copies of a game on a PC platform. Sierra had success when they changed from a text parser interface and went to a graphical interface, and all of a sudden their sales went up tenfold. They had alienated half of their existing customer base, but they were hobbyists, so they alienated 125,000 people and gained 2 million. Wasn't much of a trade-off there, an obvious trade-off. So not much of a loss. And that really speaks to how that end of it, the toy segment, ended up falling by the wayside. Into this whole maelstrom of trying to convince the consumer to go for this, Ad Lib was able to gain a decent market share, started selling a decent number of products, and it was the only product that had done so up to this point, but they were still fighting an uphill battle with the consumer. We were able to get them more and more support, and game companies kept pushing out that, hey, if you want the best experience, you need to experience it with an Ad Lib. And so you should really look down this path. But they were continuing down that line. Now, meanwhile, other people were taking notice of this. And one of the biggest people who took notice of this are the folks at Creative Labs. They were watching this from afar. In fact, they weren't even called Creative Labs then. I believe they were Creative Technologies, Singapore company, and Sim Wang Ho, their CEO, had basically noticed all of this and come over with, at that time, an inferior product called SoundBlaster. It was actually less capable than the Ad Lib's FM synthesizer. It was by barrels full a worse product. But anyway, he was able to sell the SoundBlaster to Tandy, to the Radio Shack people. And that gave him the money to be able to go forward and create the next product. So meanwhile, Tandy had this product that essentially no one wanted, and it sat on their shelves for years. But Sim was happy, and they continued forward. Then later, in around, I would say mid-1989, I received a phone call, and it was Sim from Creative. And he had said, hey, we have this product we think you might be interested in. It's called the Killer Card. And I didn't know what the Killer Card was, but that's certainly an interesting sounding name. So he asked if I'd like to see it, and if I liked it, would I do the same thing that I did for Ad Lib? And I said, sure, let's take a look at this. So he flew me out to their offices. I took a look at it, went through the whole presentation with him, and walked away stunned. I knew immediately this was the next generation. This was leaps and bounds ahead of everything Ad Lib had created previously. So in fact, I was so shocked by this that I got home, called up Ad Lib, and got Martin on the phone and said, Martin, I've seen the next generation. I've seen what's coming next. It's this Killer Card from this company, Creative Technologies. Martin said, Pshaw, you're completely nuts. Nobody's interested in anything those companies are doing. We've got the next big thing. And I said, oh, what is that? And he said, we're going to take our product and go from a 1/4-inch headphone jack to an 1/8-inch jack. It's going to revolutionize the industry. And what's funny is, at that time I was writing, I had a column, and I wrote a column. My column for that month was Ad Lib will be surpassed by Creative Technologies within a year. And as luck would have it, this is just total. I wrote that just as a lark. And 11 months later, Creative Labs was ahead of Ad Lib. So it took them only 11 months to surpass them. Now we get Creative Labs. They come on the market. They've got this new Killer Card that they rebrand the SoundBlaster. And the SoundBlaster is evolutionary. It takes the same Yamaha chip that Ad Lib had put on their card. And you have to remember that it's important to remember that Ad Lib is not a technology company. It's a music professor who came up with an idea, took an off-the-shelf part, coupled it with a headphone jack, and stuck it on a card. Not a whole lot of technology there. Creative, on the other hand, they're all engineers. They all have an engineering background. They come at it from a different perspective and a different hunger. So they take their venture capital and they immediately go to work at dismantling Ad Lib. They come up with the SoundBlaster card. They hit the market with it. It's cheaper than the Ad Lib. It has more features. If you ask somebody today, what caused Creative Labs to really surpass the Ad Lib? What was better about the SoundBlaster? Virtually everyone gets it wrong. Everyone says, they look at the feature set of the SoundBlaster and say, oh, it had digital sound. Digital sound was the deciding factor. Totally, totally wrong. The digital sound portion of the SoundBlaster didn't actually get any support whatsoever from game developers for up to 2 years after Creative Labs had already surpassed Ad Lib. So it had nothing to do with their success. In fact, the most used app at that time for the digital sound side of the card was a silly parrot that was in everything, and it did exactly what it sounds like. It parroted back what you said. If you said, Polly wants a cracker, it said, Polly wants a cracker, with a slight bit of pitch shift. And that was a rather popular little app. In fact, so much so that when I did the book, we had to include a new version of that. And people wanted a new parrot. And that was years later. So this silly little parrot stuck around for quite some time. But the real reason that the SoundBlaster beat Ad Lib was the fact that A, it was cheaper, B, you got more usable features. And again, remember what I said about the limits on landscape, real estate in a PC clone. You had limited slots. The SoundBlaster had a game port built in. This was key. If you wanted to use a joystick and you had an Ad Lib, you had to make a choice, or you had to take up another slot and spend $50 on a game port. Just a literal joystick port on a card, so you're wasting this huge slot and spending $50 more. Or you could buy a SoundBlaster for $90 less than the combo of an Ad Lib and a game port and get them both together. That was a killer combo. That's what made it the killer card. And people, the gamers, jumped on this en masse. The numbers all of a sudden started dwarfing everything Ad Lib did, where sales were in the single-digit thousands in a month. Creative immediately started selling 10, 20, 30,000 a month, 60,000 a month, and they were quickly over 100,000 a month. So the numbers were exponentially larger. We were still having some of the same issue, however. We knew this market was much bigger than what we were tapping into. And at this point, a number of us started getting together and talking about what we can do to help push this to its fullest extent, to realize the full potential. We realized that the manufacturers of the cards needed to keep up their end, keep pushing the feature set, keep providing a better product. We also needed help from the music side of things. We needed help from the developer side of things, and we needed help from the consumer side of things. So the manufacturers did what they needed to do. Then there was somebody out there by the name of George, the Fat Man Sanger. He provided virtually all the music for all the top games out there, and he's an award-winning musician, creates great music in all of these games, so we had that segment covered. Then you've got John Miles, who most people today, the only way they know his name is the Miles API, so the Miles sound system. John created this whole API to allow developers to easily plug in sound for any product that came out without having to worry about new versions of the hardware and not having to worry about really understanding sound at its lowest level. He took care of all of that. I handled the consumer side of things. I was out there writing columns for different publications, Computer Gaming World, PC Games, a number of them, and just telling consumers, here's what's really exciting, here's what's coming for Christmas, here's why you need to buy a sound card. And that combo of all of those four areas really push this thing to the next level. So Ad Lib is attempting to stay in the game, and Creative is basically eating their lunch here. And so they decide finally that they need to come out with a better product. And they, not being a technology company, they turn to their technology partner, Yamaha. And they say to Yamaha, look, Creative is really beating us up badly here. The original product isn't cutting it anymore. We need a new product. And Yamaha comes back and says, we can provide this for you 100%. We can give you a product that became known as Ad Lib Gold. This was going to be the next great product, and the specs looked wonderful. Meanwhile, Creative Labs understands that they also are starting to fall behind. They have the same product out they've had for years. It's time to rejuvenate their product line, and they need to come out with the SoundBlaster 16. So it's a rush now, and the whole industry becomes aware that this grand chase is going to happen, and whoever gets to market first is likely to be the next round's winner. What poor Ad Lib doesn't understand, not being a technology company, they're buying, as I mentioned, off-the-shelf parts from Yamaha. And Yamaha, they're dealing with Yamaha USA. Sim, meanwhile, is buying 100 times the product that Ad Lib is buying, and they're dealing with Yamaha in Japan, home office. They know everyone there. So I started watching this development and noticed that the Ad Lib Gold started hitting odd bottlenecks along the way. And they had this chip known as the MMA chip. It was a critical chip for the production of this card. Yamaha continued to have problems bringing it to market to get it to pass testing. And Ad Lib was getting more and more frustrated. And Creative, of course, continued pushing towards the SoundBlaster. And I thought this was all just good luck for Creative. Then I had a call one day with Sim, and he made it clear that, Rich, think about this. I'm dealing with the top people at Yamaha. I'm their biggest customer in this realm. They're not going to screw me. This chip will pass when I say it passes. And I had to sit back for a moment and go, whoa, that's heavy. This guy is controlling Ad Lib's fate. And at first I thought it was bravado. I thought he was just kind of saying it and being a bit bold. And he would, every 2 or 3 weeks, we would call and do a catch-up. Hey, what's going on in the industry? How are things going? And I'd note that the MMA chip was coming up for testing, and he'd tell me flat out, it will not pass. It won't pass this time. Sure enough, end of the week, it wouldn't pass. A couple of more weeks, it would come up again. He'd say, it's not going to pass. And meanwhile, the SoundBlaster 16 is getting closer and closer and closer. SoundBlaster 16 finally beats Ad Lib Gold to market. It comes out, establishes itself, starts to get a following. Ad Lib now is just apoplectic with fear. They know it's all over. They've lost all the initiative. They don't understand what's going on. And finally, Sim calls me and says, the MMA chip will pass this week. Later that week, the MMA chip passes. Over, done. It didn't matter. The Ad Lib Gold chips, they sell maybe 1,000 of them. And it just dies a quick death. Within short order, Ad Lib declares bankruptcy, and they're gone. Back in the 90s, as Creative Labs is growing their base, people start to take aim at them, and different people compete in different ways. At this point, MediaVision shows up, a company run by a guy named Paul Jan, and MediaVision showed up with a product they claimed that was SoundBlaster compatible. They claimed they had reverse engineered it, a new term at that time. And so at the same time that this was going on, Accolade had reverse engineered the Sega Genesis boot code, the BIOS code for the Sega Genesis. And so Sega sued Accolade, Creative sued MediaVision. The Sega suit got a bit of a head start on it, and everyone became aware that whichever suit came in was going to set the table for the other guys. In short order, it became obvious that the Sega suit was going to settle first. And everyone was on pins and needles to see what would happen, because this reverse engineering thing had never been tested in the courts. So Accolade arguing that they didn't need to pay Sega a license to put their games on the Sega Genesis because they had figured out how it all worked, and why should we pay you for this? You're not giving us anything. Creative just claimed, hey, you've got our proprietary software and hardware that you've broken into, and we don't think you should be able to do that. And MediaVision saying, yes, they should. So Sega starts to get further along in their lawsuit with Accolade. What no one knows at this point is that Creative Labs lawyers are part of the same family of lawyers, the same legal group that's handling Sega. So no one knows this. They're not the same lawyers, but they're from the same law firm. And so on I believe it was a Friday night or a Saturday morning, the lawyers call Creative and tell them, we've lost. Accolade wins. The judgment is closed, but it will become public Monday morning. Sim and Dick Brown decide we need to do something about this. This is drug out for ages. They call up Paul Jan at MediaVision and they give him a last-ditch offer and say, take it or leave it. Here's the deal. You're going to agree that you've done wrong. You're going to pay us a license. We'll let you put our logo on all of your boxes, but you'll pay us for all of that and a number of other mea culpas. And they tell them you've got until midnight Sunday to take us up on this offer, or else we go to the hilt with it. So both of them sit in their office, they wait this out, and the phone doesn't ring. They wait, and about 2 minutes before midnight, just like it's a movie plot, the phone rings, it's Paul Jan, he agrees to everything. They fax over all the documents, they sign everything. The next day, the news hits that Sega has lost. Had MediaVision waited 12 hours, they would have gotten everything for free. And instead, Creative walks away with this wonderful deal, and they end up making a lot out of it. MediaVision, not soon after, goes under, under the duress of having to pay all these large licensing fees. So that's how the game is played in the real world. What did I tell consumers that was interesting about the sound? First of all, it was a much more enveloping environment. Remember, we're talking about the difference between silent era and talkies. It was that dramatic. You had games that today you could not even conceive of having no sound. And that's what we had games that were meant to scare you and had no sound. We had first-person shooters with no shooting. Sports games with no sports sounds. It was just ridiculous. So to be able to paint that picture, to talk about the enveloping experience that you would get, almost a surround sound before surround sound, that seemed to be the angle that most interested consumers. If anybody knows my name at all in this industry other than the SoundBlaster book, it's for something, a silly little thing I did back in the late 80s all the way through into the mid 90s called the Patch Set Overview. And this was just my way of, to be honest, stopping phone calls and having to answer an endless litany of questions from consumers, asking the same question 100 times over. What is the best sound card? Or what is the best card, the best MIDI patch set? And to understand that, first of all, you need to understand a little bit about MIDI and its importance to the industry. So back in the early days, we talked about Ad Lib, and they have an FM synthesizer. Well, that's not really MIDI. MIDI is a definition of instruments that are kept in a table of instruments to be able to call up and say, I want to play a drum beat. Here is an actual sample of a drum. And samples of a drum, different drum types, different violins, different you name it. So a typical MIDI patch set might be general MIDI, where you have, I believe, 128 different samples of instruments, and the sound cards have these built onto them. So of course, the better the quality of that sample, the better the music will be. The two big players in that realm back in the day were Roland and Turtle Beach. Turtle Beach had a $900 sound card, which no one could afford, and Roland had about a $400 sound card, which was at least somewhat within reach. And both sounded fairly equal, so you can tell who kind of won out on that realm. But when you wanted to hear really decent music, that was the way to do it. It wasn't synthesized in the way that an FM synthesizer chip does it. So all of the new sound cards that came out started going to a MIDI patch set. Again, a set of patches or samples to be able to play back more realistic music. As I mentioned, Roland, big player, but then Creative Labs had to do this. Advanced Gravis with their ultrasound had a wonderful patch set. And it came down to basically everybody starting to measure the patch set of one card against another, and that might be a deciding factor in the product that they buy, or for developers, the product that they support. Sierra, for example, Sierra Online was a big supporter of Roland. They wanted that really deep music experience for their King's Quest series and other Quest series, adventure games, where that was important. And you didn't get quite the same experience from an Ad Lib or a SoundBlaster card. So as time goes on, the MIDI portion of the audio industry loses steam. All of a sudden, wavetable takes over, wave sound effects, so digital sound, and it supplants the whole MIDI side of things. The patch set overview that I put out, you can see it if you look at it over time. In the late 80s into the 90s, it's all about the quality of the patches in the different cards. And somewhere in the middle, I start adding a section at the bottom about just sound cards in general. And by the time I end in 95, the sound card section is 98% of the document, and the MIDI section is the remaining 2%. So it's quite, you get to see the evolution of that going along. One of the curious things about the early days, it was very much like the Wild West for a lot of us. There were no rules. Everything we did, we had to learn for the first time because there were no tools. There were no guidelines for how to pull off different tricks or techniques. We had to invent them all. Remember, I owned a quality assurance company. It was the very first one, so we had to come up with the whole idea of how do you test somebody else's products. And again, so we were used to this kind of thinking outside the box. And most of the developers that I worked with fit the same type of out-of-the-box thinking. Some of the most creative people I've ever met, in fact, virtually all the most creative people I've ever met come from the games industry. Now you go back into that Wild West metaphor. And one of the things that occurred very early on, I happened to be also the very first sports announcer in any PC game. That came about because Chris Weaver from Bethesda Softworks had approached us to test Wayne Gretzky hockey. And we had tested a few iterations of this, few versions of this, and it was a very popular game. And we realized that the next generation should be an announcer. Let's jump on this bandwagon and be the first ones out there to do this. So I had actually convinced Chris Berman from ESPN to do the announcing for this game. And at the time, I believe he wanted something like $50,000 to do it. Chris Weaver saw this, and Chris is notorious for being a little tight with the money, so he's very careful there, but he decided that was way too much money, and he had a better idea. He came to me and said, "You have a deep voice. You've got a radio voice. Why don't you do it?" And I thought, why wouldn't I do this? This is something I can tell the grandkids about. And so I said, sure, yeah. And I did it for something, if I remember right, I think it might have been $500 or $1,000. And so I thought I would put in a couple of days of recording samples and we'd be done. I worked with their head programmer, a guy by the name of Craig Walton, wonderful programmer. And Craig and I ended up spending months working on this. What we ended up doing was inventing everything as we went along. We realized we need concatenation. We need to record every single number from 0 to 99. We need to record every NHL team and city. We need to record every type of penalty, any type of interaction. We need to record, my God, we have to go to an ice rink and record the sound of a puck hitting the rink, hitting the boards. We had to record stadium sounds and crowds. All of these things had not been done before. There was no library to go to just pull sounds like you would today. Hey, I need this kind of a car with this year and this kind of a door in this kind of weather. None of that existed. So we had to sit down and record thousands of samples. And then I'd record all these, send them off to Craig, and he'd come back and say, these aren't working. And I'd say, what do you mean they're not working? I recorded them, we were careful, and remember, no sound studios, we had basic microphones. We found out that on a Monday, my voice sounded a certain way, and then on a Tuesday, it sounded entirely different. Same thing on a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We then found out the humidity was a big factor, whether I had the sniffles. So virtually anything could impact the sound of your voice. We then also found out that intonation was a huge issue. We would try to couple something like a typical snippet would be Flyers penalty, number 27, 2 minutes for slashing. When you record that straight, it sounds wonderful. But when you clip it and try to reconnect it with different pieces, different towns, different numbers, it doesn't connect properly. So we played around with different things. So on top of all the humidity issues and the differences in your voice was this connector. And we had to come up with a way to make it more seamless, the interconnection of those pieces. And we came up with what today is called totting. So I would make a sound between the samples. I would say Flyers, tss, and then say the next word and record. So between every phrase, I would just sit there, you'd sound like a moron. Tss, tss, tss. But you find out that when you connect them, all of a sudden they connect far more easily. But again, we were the first ones to sit down and figure this out. In the end, you can still see a product that's out there. If you YouTube it, you can find an example of it and you'll laugh your head off. It is one of the most rudimentary pieces of audio in a game, but at that time, it was cutting edge and the very first of its type. There is a funny footnote from that story. For years after this game came out, I would meet people at shows, random people, and they'd say, "Do I know you?" And I'd think for a moment and go, no, I don't think so. And they'd say, "There's just something about you. You sound so familiar." Ah, sound. "Are you a Wayne Gretzky fan?" And they go, "You're the announcer." That happened for years. So that was quite a nice little thing to happen. Totting. What is totting? Totting is essentially a means by which to get your two connected, unconnected pieces of audio sample to connect more cleanly. One of the best examples of this is Microsoft Flight Simulator. When they had to create air traffic control chatter, there's lots of literally thousands of samples that have to be combined there. And obviously you can't know in advance what these, it's very hard to know how many combinations you're gonna have, because down the line you might add a new aircraft or you might add a new location and you wanna be able to just drop in new audio that will work. So their engineers found out a variation that's better than my ch sound is tot. So they would say tot between the words. So you would have something like United tot, flight tot, 217 tot. And when you cut those, it's much easier. You get a much cleaner seam to be able to connect those two disparate pieces into a what seemingly seamless piece of audio. So we've talked about how audio is the ugly stepsister of video, and it still is that way today. As much as we've learned, today a gamer will think nothing of spending $600 on a video card. But if you ask them to spend that kind of money on a sound card or a headphone or an earphone, they'll look at you like you're crazy. Anything over $50 is just more than they had anticipated spending. So they will often ask why they need to bother. And one of the examples I give all the time is, well, you can use a butter knife as a screwdriver, but it's far from optimal. Yes, it may get the job done messily, but you really want to use a screwdriver. So when you want to get the best possible audio experience, you want a product that was designed for audio, and especially for gaming. What most consumers have no concept of today is that 99% of the products in front of them were designed for an entirely different medium, music. And music is all about experiencing, being enveloped by that experience, to just be enveloped by the sounds. All of the manufacturers of headphones and earphones enhance the output of their products, so that what you're getting is essentially their rendition of what they think music should sound like. In the case of Asian companies, Asians tend to like a brighter sound. They have a brighter ear, so you get colored highs. American consumers love their bass. So we have companies like Bose who boost the bass factors above what the original music intended. If you hear something with a flat response, that is the music as it was intended to be played, you'll be completely shocked. It will initially sound a bit dull to you, but in time you'll actually find that you hear far more detail that you've never heard before. And as a gamer, especially a first-person shooter, this is critical. You want to be able to hear all of those body sounds, all of those spatial cues that the designer has put into the game for you. And here, if you use the wrong product, you're hearing none of them. Instead of that, when somebody throws a grenade, you get a bunch of muddied echoes that cover up all of these spatial cues. So you want to use the right product. Go out and get a product that's designed for games, or better yet, get something that's just a high-end flat response device. Many times throughout my career and even throughout this interview, I've said that audio is the ugly stepsister of video. and that it continues to remain so today, and it did so all through the entire evolution of audio during the 80s and the 90s and into the 2000s. To underscore this, if you look back at a very popular product of that time, IBM was trying to make a big name for themselves after having kind of lost the lead on the PC hardware side. They had OS/2. This was going to be their big operating system. They worked hand in hand with their partners Microsoft to create it, and then there was a falling out along the way. And IBM decided that they were going to go on without Microsoft and prove that they could win this all back. So they create this next DOS/Windows compatible operating system, and it had a version 1.0 and a version 2.0, and it was gaining a bit of market share, but they realized it wasn't really reaching consumer. So they created something called OS/2 Warp, which was version 3.0. This was designed to be fully compatible with everything that the mainstream consumer wanted. It would load Windows and every app in Windows would work. It would load DOS and every DOS app and game would work. That was the idea. So IBM, to prove the point, they wanted to prove this compatibility issue, actually hired my QA company to do the testing on the game side. And so we ended up looking at over 400 different games on OS/2. And so we tested all of these. It took months. During this entire testing process, we ended up having a dialogue with IBM weekly, and we kept telling them, we've got some problems. And the notes continued to get more and more alert-driven that it's getting worse. It's not getting better. Things are not running as you would expect them. These products are not working with OS/2. Finally, by the time we get done, we get through 400 plus products and literally a handful work. So I get called into a meeting with all of the highest IBM brass, their CEO, the head of the PC division, the head of the software division, the head of the OS/2 division, you name it, they're there. I'm there. They want to know what the definition of work is. And so we lay out our matrix. Here's how we define whether a product works. And they identify one thing. This thing that if we look at this right, 90% of the products fail because they don't have sound. And I said, yes, that's correct. They don't have sound. And they said, and what's the problem? And I was dumbfounded. What do you mean? What's the problem? They said, well, they're just games. And that just, I could not understand this. I tried to explain Gone with the Wind without sound, gave them all kinds of other examples, and they just said, no one cares about sound. These work, and you need to sign off on this. And I said, no, I'm not going to sign off on that. The person who hired me got fired. They basically went on and claimed compatibility when they didn't have it, and OS/2 is no longer with us today, but it failed miserably on the consumer front, all because they could not understand how important audio was to the consumer by that point.